Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Believe It or Not, How to Spot and Avoid Scams. This webinar is organized by the Law Society Pro Bono Services Office and the Financial Industry Disputes Resolution Center Limited, FIDReC. I'm your moderator for this evening and my name is Liansheng. Thank you for joining us. First, some housekeeping matters. Of course, please try not to take screenshots or share the materials here without the permission of the organizers. There are some relevant materials for today's talk. They can be downloaded from the resource link, which will be shared with you in a chat function. The link will also be shared in a follow-up email that will be sent to you tomorrow. Please feel free to ask any questions during the webinar. You can type them using the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. Your questions will only be seen by the organizers. We'll do our best to address them during the talk or at the end of the talk. Please note that the discussion and materials provided here today is not intended to substitute or constitute professional legal advice. If you have any specific legal queries, you should consult a lawyer. All right, so with the housekeeping matters done, let's get right into the discussion. I'm very excited about today's webinar because this is the hot topic of the season. It's about scams. And on April Fool's Day, no less, we have come across many reports, articles, friends, or even stories shared by our family members, some of them even being victims of scam. And today we have two very distinguished speakers with us, Ms. Angelina Hing, as well as Ms. Eunice Chua, to help shed light on how to identify scams, as well as to avoid them, and what to do when we are in the unfortunate situation of being a victim of a scam. Let me first introduce Ms. Hing. Ms. Angelina Hing is the founder and managing director of Integro Law Chambers. She has extensive experience in the legal field, from being an established litigator to being a district judge of the Family Justice Courts to being an adjudicator as well as a mediator. Angelina is also an accredited principal mediator with the Singapore Mediation Center and also an appointed adjudicator with FIDReC. Next, we have Ms. Eunice Chua. Eunice is the CEO of FIDReC. Prior to her appointment at FIDReC, she was an assistant professor at the Singapore Management University School of Law. She remains a research fellow of the Singapore International Dispute Resolution Academy at the school. And thank you, Angelina and Eunice, for joining us today.
Thank you, Liansheng.
Thank you.
Hi. So, to give our audience a sense of what to expect for this evening's webinar, I will outline what we'll be discussing in the webinar today. First, we'll be sharing with you how we can better protect ourselves from scams. We'll also be discussing the various types of scams, the role of FIDReC when it comes to scams, and what to do when we encounter these scams. We'll also be addressing some of the resources available for victims of scams. Lastly, we have a Q&A session, which we'll conclude the webinar with, to answer the queries that have been put forth by the attendees, if you have not already answered them during our webinar. Okay, so this is how we start, and let's start. Okay, Eunice, I start with you first. Okay, I know that there are many resources and information on the internet about scams, right? Let's start with the basics. Would you like to share with the audience and the attendees of our webinars today some of this information that you can find on the internet?
Sure, Liansheng. The best website I've seen so far, especially for Singapore, is scamalert.sg. This is a site that is curated and prepared by the National Crime Prevention Council. So there is lots of information, and there's even some quizzes that you can do to test yourself to see whether you are likely or not to fall prey to scams. And I must say, I tried it out myself, and I also did not score 100%, and I learned something at the end of it. So I do encourage everyone to go to scamalert.sg to look around and learn something new.
Yes, so scamalert.sg, I understand because I also had a look at it. It shares stories of some of the victims. It also has various categories of scams, things like loan scams, even impersonation scams, internet love scams. And I must say, I was quite educated by it because there's so many different types of scams nowadays. Yeah. Angelina, what about you? What are the types of scams that you have come across in your experience, perhaps as an adjudicator at FIDReC?
Well, okay, there is, the fact of the matter is scammers are increasingly sophisticated. And these days, you're not going to get a phone call and say, hello, give me your OTP. It's just not going to happen. So this particular case that I presided over, adjudicator on, was, to me, was very sophisticated, and that was last year. So imagine they probably polished up their act even greater this year. But essentially, this particular case started with the victim receiving a phone call from Microsoft, purportedly saying that it's just a regular service call and they were calling just to upgrade so that his program is not laggy and all of that. And so he obviously agreed to let them get access, remote access to his comm, but he was watching what they did all the time. He didn't leave them with the computer free rein, right? So he was watching. But at some point, this particular victim felt uncomfortable because they were asking a little bit more questions, and he felt uncomfortable. And so he stopped the remote access, and he said, okay, I don't think I'm comfortable divulging any more information. Let me call your office tomorrow to verify, because by then it was evening. So the scammers are really smart. They called about 5 o'clock. So by the time the whole thing in the office is closed, right? So the next morning, about 9 to 10 o'clock, he called Microsoft office only to find there was no such staff. So obviously, now imagine that if you were that person, you would probably be in a panic, right? And you're wondering, okay, what happened? Did you lose anything? Shortly after that, that same day, he receives SMS purportedly from the bank, saying from the fraud department, saying that that his account has been hacked, and that he should, I can't remember whether it was click on the link or whatever, but he received a phone call, and after that, following the SMS, and it was requested, and they requested him to give their OTP because they need to block the account, etc., etc. Now, of course, now we know that everybody now knows, right, that we shouldn't give an OTP under any circumstance. But this, you must understand, this was last year. When you click on websites and all that, you have this tiny little thing, do not share. Now it's flashing in your face, right? Especially since the OCBC scam. So the poor guy gave the OTP and all, and within 24 hours, lots of money got siphoned out of his account. I think the point is this: this could have happened to any one of us. This person was educated. And what I think was preyed upon was fear. And what was scary was that, I think it's my surmise that the earlier Microsoft one was part of the scam. It's just that wasn't the true scam. It was to put someone in fear and be vulnerable to divulge information. So essentially, just be very vigilant, because scammers are extremely, extremely sophisticated these days.
And just before the webinar, we were discussing how it's almost like a cat and mouse game, right? Once we start educating the public about different steps to take to protect themselves, then the scammers will get more and more sophisticated.
Absolutely.
It's no longer a one source, for instance, or whatever. It will be a series,
Absolutely.
like a good novel, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Speaking of the OCBC scam, of course, everyone must have known about the phishing scam that occurred, because so many people lost their hard-earned monies and savings from the OCBC scam. And of course, one of the measures that came up after that was, of course, the removal of clickable links in SMSs and things like that. So other than the removal of clickable links, Eunice, would you like to share with us maybe, what are the steps that you can take in order to better protect yourselves from this kind of scams?
I think the first step really is what we are trying to do now, which is to share more information about scams so that you have a sense of what a scam looks like, what scammers usually do as part of their standard operating procedure, so that we can spot the signs. And I think the first thing is to try and learn about what are the key aspects. And I think there are a few that are easy for us to remember, and the first Angelina has alluded to is whenever someone asks for your OTP, this is a sign of a scam, because no legitimate organization, be it your bank or the government, should be asking you to divulge your one-time password, right? So that would be a big sign. Another sign is when you receive some kind of information that needs your urgent response, some worrying information, or it could also be a very tempting offer, right? So worrying information is what Angelina shared with us, that your account has been hacked. We noticed that someone has added a payee to your account. Oh, your account has some issues, and they need you to take certain quick action. And as Angelina says, this preys immediately on our fears and our insecurities, and we tend to want to act quickly. Yeah. The other thing that makes us want to act quickly is if there's some kind of tempting offer. And maybe this is where regional syndicates start targeting Singaporeans, because we like to take advantage of good offers. We like a good bargain. But this is where this can also be a problem. And this has led to, for example, loan scams where unlicensed money lenders, they advertise loans with attractive rates and through SMS or some other social media, and you can get it very quickly. Well, all these are also signs of scams, because in reality, in Singapore, licensed money lenders cannot advertise on social media, messaging apps, or SMS, right? So this is a sign of a scam. And if it's on an e-commerce platform, with a popular item that is very, very cheap, well, it is also something that we should worry about. We should always look at who the seller is, and we should, be careful to only trust reputable and authorized sellers. And finally, another type of scam, which is quite common now, which also preys on, our desire to get a good deal, would be investment scams. And those we have seen at FIDReC, where someone thinks that they can make money out of a certain investment very quickly. It could be they see it on Facebook being advertised, or someone forwarded them, on WhatsApp, WeChat, a recommendation. And this has led to monies being lost as well. Yeah.
I mean, nowadays you also see people, sending messages about jobs that you can get a very short time with good remuneration, right? And on social media platforms.
Exactly. And actually, the police has recently told us that job scams have now become the number one scam, right? And we can see now scammers again preying on how people now in this COVID-19 pandemic are trying to find some jobs to get a bit of extra income. Yeah.
And I thought I'll add to that, right? Is that if one of the things that you should bear in mind is if you are entering in something or engage in a conversation where you are supposed to get some money, but you end up being asked to give money, just make sure that all your alert signs go up, because you're supposed to remember you wanted to do something to get money. You want to find a job to get money. If somebody asks you to give them money first, then just be very vigilant and aware and suspicious.
We have a question from an attendee. So the question is, what do we do when we get approached by scammers? Should we just ignore them? Should we just cut the line if they call us? Or do we try to quarrel with them and tell them that, hey, what you're doing is actually wrong? So this is a question from the attendees.
It's a good question. Well, personally, I would just turn off the phone. I would just cut the call, only because I don't really have time to engage. But actually, I'm thinking along, if we're going to be a little bit more civic mindedness, I think we could actually report the number and all that, so that at least they can't repeat the same thing there again. I believe there's a place to do that. I thought I saw. I'm not sure whether it's a Scam Alert also has. You can share a story, or I think, if I'm not mistaken, I've also recalled seeing that certain police sites, you can actually report that number, so that the number will be on the blacklist.
Yes, Angelina, that's right. On the Scam Alert website, you would see a reference to the anti-scam helpline, 1-800-722-6688. And this is where you can report scams that have happened to you or people that you know, so that their stories can be shared, and also the police will be alerted. Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, in some of the stories that I see on Scam Alert, they even show the number that is being used to call them, and it's shared on the various categories of scams as well. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Okay. So we'll talk about the different types of scams. We talk about the psychology of scams, right? What would be the red flags? Having a good offer, etc. What about the tangible things that we can do? For example, I've heard of checking the domain names, right? Or would that be something that perhaps the attendees could also be alerted to?
Yes, and Liansheng, I must say that last year when I was doing some of these scam talks, one of the suggestions I would give was, check the website address. Does it begin with HTTP or HTTPS? Because HTTPS is a more secure protocol, right? But lately, I have also seen that scammers have caught up. So now they are also using HTTPS sites to get your data. The transfer protocol might be secure, but they can still end up with your data. Yeah. So now my recommendation is this: to check the domain name, as you have said. And what is the domain name? This is the word before the .sg or .com or .org, right? And it is before the first slash. So just to give an example, if you look at the FIDReC address that I have given, www.fidrec.com.sg/process, here FIDReC is the domain name. It is just before the .com.sg and it's before the first slash. So if you go to this website, this is a FIDReC website, and it tells you about our FIDReC process. But if you go to the second one, and you see it says www.fidrec.process.com.sg/home. Right here, the domain name is not FIDReC. It is actually process, the word that is immediately before the .com.sg, and this will take you to another website. So we really have to look quite closely. And I gathered some pictures that were in the news recently, and let's look at them together. If we look at the next slide, you can see that this was one of the scams that we were being warned about recently, where DBS was the target now. Yeah. And the person would get a message, right, with a link, and you see it's HTTPS, right? So my earlier advice doesn't work so well anymore. But now you see, if you look carefully, it says internet-alerts-dbs.com. So actually here the domain name is not dbs.com, which is the correct site for DBS. It is actually internet-alerts-dbs, right? And if you click on that site, you go to this page on your mobile. You can also see the domain name there. It looks very much like the DBS website, but it is actually not. It is a scam website. So this is where many of us who are busy might miss it, and especially like Angelina says, if we are already in fear and we want to take quick action, we might end up clicking on this link and keying in information. So the first thing to do if you suspect that you've been scammed is not to click on the link, but to go directly to your bank's website or call the bank's hotline. And this can be found at the back of your ATM card. If you don't want to search around on the web, just take out your ATM card, look at it. You can get the hotline number immediately and call the bank directly. Yeah.
Angelina, what about the? It reminds me, because talking about domain name, we have also had a few scams targeting law firms where they change the email addresses, to look very similar to lawyers' email addresses.
Yes.
Generally, other than being attentive to such things, and of course to contact the banks or contact the relevant personnel if you are suspicious of the activity, what do you think other tips that you can share with the attendees that will help prevent or protect them from these scams?
Okay, there are a couple of things, right? One is to always upgrade and update your own software, right? Because your phone, your laptop, computer will always need to be upgrading, because otherwise your machine will be vulnerable to attacks. So that's another practical way. I know that we're all very busy. Even I am not that disciplined doing that, but increasingly feeding the need to do that. So that's another thing I can think of, that we can sort of protect ourselves, you know, to make sure that our whatever we're using, because nowadays the everything is on your phone. You do banking, everything. Singapore is supposed to be digitalized. So we in that sense we have become a lot more vulnerable than before.
And almost everything, like you say, is done electronically. I mean, I myself, for example, even transport charges are paid using, PayWave. You can go out and spend a day without having to pay any cash.
Yeah. So I'm not there yet. My children are. So I'm not there yet. I'm still, holding on to the traditional wallet. But I am a little bit ashamed when I walk into Chinatown and then the uncle who is selling the Zhu Cha Tang or whatever also has the Pay Now and the Pay La. And I looks at me and 你为什么不用这个? So I realized that, okay, I need to keep up.
Yeah, I guess with convenience, you must also sort of be more attentive to the transactions that we are going through. Yes. I think when we were discussing on a webinar, Eunice also spoke about, for example, what about notifications when there are transactions on your card, right? Some of us may actually up the limit because we don't want to be bothered by the notifications that come in. But sometimes these are the notifications which saves us from further scams, because they will usually take a small amount and then they'll subsequently take more and more amounts from our bank accounts.
Yes. And I think just to chip in here, we can also look at, what are the responsibilities actually that consumers have under the regulations. If we look at the MAS, e-payments user protection guidelines, it generally sets out 3 main responsibilities for consumers. The first is to protect access to your account. So like Angelina says, this is about protecting your OTP, protecting your account information. When we're talking about credit cards and mobile phones, it's also about protecting your devices. They also nowadays give access, right, to your money. Yeah, so number 1 is protecting access. Number 2 is the monitoring of the notifications. And that's your point, Liansheng, that we get many notifications, but that is our obligation to actually read them and monitor them. So we've had cases at FIDReC where the customer has not responded to the notifications, although these have been sent. And this also leads us to another issue, because last year again there was a scam where SMSs were being diverted, right? And that was also another problem. Yeah, but we are told by MAS and the police that this issue has been resolved, right? So we should monitor our notifications very carefully. And the last obligation we have is to report immediately. So not at a moment that is convenient or so on, right? But when you see the notification and something is wrong, we have to report immediately. Unless, of course, you're on the plane, right? You have no, there's some good reason, then I think our financial institutions will be reasonable and fair. But other than that, we must really try and do our best to report as soon as possible.
So just to chime in case anybody in the audience be tearing their hair out, because first of all, we're saying, okay, be very careful. Don't act on these SMSs. Don't click on them, because the banks don't send out clicks anymore. But then at the same time, so in case any one of you in the audience are thinking in your mind earlier that, okay, I will just ignore them, then now you've heard from Eunice, no, you cannot ignore them. You have to look at these SMSs and decipher whether they are true, they are scam or not scams. So the answer to the earlier part is not to ignore them. Okay, the only thing I think you can potentially ignore are unknown numbers that tries to call you on your phone and starting with +65. I think those might be safe. And even if you miss some of those real calls, if they are urgent, they will call you again. And if they are a friend and you mean something to them, they will call you until you answer the phone. They will find other means of reaching you if they can't get you the first time around. So I think that's the thing I wanted to say.
Um, we have a question from an attendee about the relationship between the consumers as well as the banks. So Eunice mentioned about the banking code, about the obligations that consumers have. Are there also responsibilities on the part of the banks or the financial institutions?
Yes, definitely. And I see Angelina also nodding vigorously. Definitely, there are obligations under the law, right? But we do know that MAS is looking at this issue right now. We are told that the MAS Payments Council is looking to issue some new framework for us that will allocate the responsibilities of banks and customers. But definitely for the financial institutions, their responsibilities are to protect their customers by having some controls in place to safeguard their customer accounts and some measures to detect and respond to suspicious transactions. At the moment, it is not so clear because there is no sort of a standard for what level of protection is required and so on. So at FIDReC, our educators like Angelina will really have to, work on a case-by-case basis to see what the facts are and try and apply the broad principles. But going forward, we can look forward. Yes, we can look forward to this new framework that will help us to decide better how the scam losses should be shared. Yeah.
But I think to just add on to that, I think common sense would basically tell us this. If the consumer has not been negligent in any way, has not given out OTPs, have guarded your devices properly and all that, and the losses and the scammers have managed to siphon funds due to a security lapse, for example, then I cannot imagine that a consumer should be made responsible. So just broadly speaking, right? Unfortunately, in most cases, there is usually some sharing of responsibility. There's usually some lapses, even on the consumer's part, usually. So which is, I think that's the reason why we all have to be vigilant. I mean, all of us are vulnerable.
And because the responsibility falls both ways, so there will always be disputes, and that's where FIDReC comes into place, right, Eunice? Because FIDReC, of course, I understand now FIDReC stands for the Financial Institution Dispute Resolution Center. We have talked about FIDReC multiple times in the past half an hour. Eunice, could you let us know a little bit about what FIDReC is? How does FIDReC feature in the scams? What role does FIDReC play?
FIDReC is a independent organization. We're a company limited by guarantee, and we have been designated by the Monetary Authority of Singapore to handle disputes between financial institutions and their customers, right? And currently, our remit is for individual customers. So you are either a sole proprietor or you are a person. So we currently don't handle complaints from companies at the moment. Yeah. And there is a limit of $100,000 per claim at adjudication. And I must also share that before coming to FIDReC, of course, the complainant should first report to their financial institution and see whether they can resolve it with the institution directly, right? If there is a problem there and the resolution is not satisfactory after 4 weeks, this is where the consumer can then come to FIDReC. FIDReC is very affordable. Our mission is really to provide an avenue where through mediation and adjudication, amicable ways, customers can resolve their disputes with financial institutions. This is done outside of the court. No lawyers are involved in the process because it is meant to be very cost effective and simple for an ordinary person to navigate. So even the financial institutions, they cannot be represented by lawyers, right? They will send their staff to speak on their behalf. I'll just give you also an outline of the FIDReC process. This slide will show a flow of the process, and it starts with a consumer coming to us with a dispute. Now we have just upgraded our website so that you can actually file your dispute online. So any time of the day, you can log on to fidrec.com.sg and register an account to file your dispute. It is a private and confidential process, and this is meant to protect the consumer as well. So, for example, if the outcome is not in the consumer's favor, right, the consumer's rights will not be affected. They can still continue to pursue a claim in court if they think that they have a strong case. Yeah. There is also no cost at all for the claim to be filed at FIDReC, right? Under the MAS Dispute Resolution Scheme regulations, because MAS has designated FIDReC as the dispute resolution body, all the financial institutions licensed by MAS, they have to subscribe to us and they will fund the operation. So this is a model which encourages responsibility on the part of the financial institutions. So when the case comes in, the first thing we do is we look at it to verify if it is within our ability to handle. And this is set out in our terms of reference, which is on our website. But some of the key provisions that most often come up are, number one, if you come to us too late, right? More than 6 months after the financial institution has already given you a final reply, then we cannot handle the dispute, right? So please come to us in a timely manner. And the second area where we often have to turn away disputes is because the complaint is not against a licensed financial institution. Yeah, and in those situations, we don't have any powers, right? These unlicensed financial institutions have no obligation to respond to us, or to to even come to FIDReC. So this is also a challenge. Yeah. In terms of the process, then the service we offer, there's two parts to it. The first is mediation, which is a process for our case managers to try and facilitate discussions. They will ask the consumer for information about their claim, any supporting documents, and fully understand what the complaint is about. They will also go to the financial institution and ask the institution to investigate and share with us a report to detail what the investigation outcome is. So we will arrange for information, to be exchanged, and then this can be done, on the phone, through email, sometimes in-person meetings or online meetings nowadays. And the aim here is to see whether we can help the two parties come to any amicable settlement. Yeah. But of course, all this is voluntary. So if you, as a consumer, you don't agree that the proposal being made to you is reasonable, there's no obligation on you to accept it. You can always go to the next stage of our process, which is where your claim will then be heard by an adjudicator who will be an experienced lawyer like Angelina, perhaps a retired judge, or some other very senior and respected member of the community. For the adjudication phase, there is a small charge of $50, and this is because the consumer does need to do some work here. They will need to prepare submissions. They will need to also appear before the adjudicator to make their case. And so this fee is to signify that they are committed to this process of adjudication. And at the end of the day, after the adjudicator has considered the arguments and all the evidence, they will prepare written grounds of decision, which FIDReC will then arrange to read to the consumer so that they will know what the outcome is. And like I said earlier, one very interesting feature is that this is not binding on the consumer. So this means the consumer's legal rights are not affected. You can disagree with the decision, there is no obligation on you to accept it. Yeah. However, it is binding on the financial institution. And so if an award is made, the financial institution will be obliged to pay. And we have had a very good record of financial institutions keeping up their end of the bargain. Yes.
Eunice, I have a question from the attendees as well. You talked about licensed financial institutions. Will you be able to give some examples of who these entities might be?
Yes. So these would include banks, life insurers, general insurers, capital market services licensees, insurance brokers, and also independent financial advisors. There is a list on the MAS website called the Financial Institutions Directory, where you can refer to. There is also on the FIDReC website a list of all the institutions that have subscribed to us. If you just go right to the bottom, of the page, to the financial institutions page, you can do a quick search and you can tell whether or not a certain institution is actually our subscriber. Yeah. So if someone says that they are, these are the reliable sources that you can check on that information.
And I have a question for Angelina. Having looked at the flow process of FIDReC, I am curious about the adjudication that you do at FIDReC. Could you share with the attendees maybe how is the process like? Is it very scary? Because I understand that lawyers can't be involved in the adjudication, and the claimant would have to do it him or herself.
That's right. So essentially, it is very informal. Well, informal in a sense that, it's an informal setting, okay? But what I mean by informal is nobody's going to be held by the strict rules of law, if you've spoken, speak now, forever hold your peace sort of thing. So what happens is, yes, there will be opening statements, you've got to tell your story, and both parties will get a chance to ask the other party questions. The whole idea really is that the whole story needs to come forward, right? And who did what, who didn't do what, who said this, what were the representations that were made, for example. All of that needs to surface. And actually, because no lawyers are involved, a lot of times when I adjudicate a case, I end up asking a lot of questions only because I need to be clear in my mind as to what actually happened. So in that sense, it is informal, right? And don't worry about too much of a process. I think all the adjudicators will be very aware that nobody is legally trained. And the whole purpose of the hearing really is to ascertain the facts, is to find out what really happened so that we can come to a fair decision.
I also have a question from the attendee. There are quite a number of questions coming in. So what about disputes involving financial institutions that are not licensed or not under a sort of a partnership with FIDReC? What should the person do when they're faced with such a situation?
So I will give an answer, and then perhaps Angelina can chip in as well, wearing her hat as a lawyer rather than as an adjudicator of FIDReC. So from the FIDReC perspective, if this institution, although not licensed, is contactable, right? And they are willing to come to FIDReC, right? Then because both parties are willing, FIDReC can assist you, okay? But we would need you to bring the other side to us because we have no power to bring people to FIDReC if they don't want to come, okay? So that is for unlicensed financial institutions that are contactable and are willing to come to FIDReC. Many overseas institutions, that might prove more of a challenge because they are not in Singapore and they may not have an incentive to come. And if you do want to pursue any claims against them, that is where you may have to turn to a lawyer like Angelina, or if there's a crime committed, of course, the police. Yeah.
Yeah, I think as Eunice has mentioned, FIDReC does not have powers over the unlicensed one. So if you want to pursue a claim against them, you would have to get legal advice and do it the civil claim way. Sue them in court, basically.
I also have another question from an attendee about the willingness of the financial institutions to partake in the mediation or the adjudication process. So this attendee shared that, or rather queried if the financial institutions' representatives will, for example, send their lawyers or their legal counsel to come and attend these sessions, and would it then be quite a power imbalance between the claimant as well as the financial institutions? Eunice, what do you have to say about that?
Our experience is that usually the financial institutions will send their staff, perhaps someone from the customer service department or from the business department, the persons who have sold the products, for example. Now and then we do have a legal counsel, but just in the same way, now and then we have consumers who are lawyers themselves, right? We cannot block these people from the process. But I think what I can say is that during the mediation, it is voluntary. So nobody can force you to do anything, and you are free to tell your story. And our case manager is also involved in the mediation. They are the crucial, neutral third party there, and they will, facilitate the process. So for example, if the financial institution is not forthcoming when you're talking to the financial institution directly, when our staff approach them, right, we can sometimes, remind them of their obligations as well as what some of the regulations say, so that they are able to help as much as they can. But then the other challenge, of course, is, there is some limit to that as well. We also do require cooperation from both parties. And when you go to adjudication, as Angelina says, the adjudicator is independent, right? They are not a staff of FIDReC. They have not been part of the mediation. So they start on a clean page and they will hear both parties. And as Angelina also said, the adjudicator can ask questions, right? And if there's anything that they feel is not addressed, whether because the consumer is not aware, or sometimes the financial institution, they're also not legally trained, so they also do not give the full picture. The adjudicator will then ask for more information. Yeah,
that's right. And I wanted to add this about imbalance of power. I think the beauty and the mission of FIDReC is exactly to address the imbalance of power. So remember what Eunice said, that the adjudication, the award that is eventually out, is binding on the financial institution and not on the consumer. Now, that's a very important point to note, because if that is the case, then imagine this: the financial institution has every incentive to cooperate and make sure that they're on up and up and be very on the ball and behave properly, because the ultimate decision binds them, whereas it does not bind the consumer. So actually, the very mission of it, right, is to address the imbalance of power issue.
Actually, that's what I thought of as well, because FIDReC by its name is about financial institution dispute resolution. So it's there to help, right,
Yes.
resolve the conflicts, and the conflicts we are looking at consumer versus the financial institutions. I have another question that came in about statistics, about the cases. There's an attendee who wants to know about the statistics relating to mediated cases between FIDReC and financial institutions. That's one. There was another question that came in asking about whether there are statistics relating to FIDReC handling disputes between bank customers and financial institutions relating to scam. Because from this attendee's point of view, he or she thinks that for bank disputes, it would mostly or largely get decided in the court of public opinion. So he or she is wondering about the utility of engaging FIDReC in such scams and disputes between the consumer and the banks.
On the first question for the general statistics, we publish an annual report every year, and in that report we will share about how many cases we handle, and what these cases were about, what type of financial institutions were complained about, and we will also share some case studies. This would be on the FIDReC website, so if you want a bit more detail, that is one place you can go. But generally speaking, when we try and measure the outcomes at mediation, we will track the cases that are completed at the mediation stage, meaning that they do not go further to adjudication. And then we will also break that down to see, of those cases that did not progress to adjudication, how many were there a settlement agreement entered into, and how many were there no settlement agreement, right? Because there could be cases where through the mediation process, and the bank has given some acknowledgement to the customer understands better their obligations, there may or may not be a settlement. So generally speaking, about 70 to 75% of our cases, they stop at the mediation stage and they don't go further. And of those, about half there is a settlement agreement, and about half there is no settle agreement. So that is the general picture. For scams specifically, I actually did prepare a slide on that that I will just trouble Kelvin to put up. And this slide will show you the trend at FIDReC where it comes to the number of fraud or scam claims at FIDReC. So I've broken it up into half year, just to give you a bit more detail. And my colleague Simon has also kindly broken it down further so you can see what kinds of products are involved. And the red section would be your credit card cases. And so this points to a lot of phishing scams actually coming to FIDReC, or scams where there are unauthorized transactions on your credit card. This is a very common kind of case at FIDReC. And you see that it has been on the rise, since 2020. Okay. For savings accounts, these are the kinds of cases where, but an example is what Angelina had said, right? You logged onto a scam website, right? And the scammer now has your digital bank ID, right? And then they go in and take out your monies directly from your savings account. And then we have a very small group of others, which involve things like telegraphic transfers, loan scams, some loans, and then there's also one or two where they involve some foreign equities and bonds. But generally speaking, it is the credit cards that we have to be very watchful of, because once the details are released, the convenience of our credit card also makes it convenient for the scammer, right, to take your money. Yeah.
I also want to assure people that we are not planting the question. These are actually the Q&A that I'm seeing as it comes along. And we did indeed prepare a slide for Eunice to just share with us about the scams, because I think we also wanted to highlight that there's a growing trend. I mean, if you look at the graph, it looks like there are a couple of hundreds of cases being dealt with at FIDReC relating to such scams. Okay, I want to ask a question, because this is also another question that is on the Q&A, which is relating to banks' reply, right? Are there any differences between if there's an OTP issued in a situation and then the OTP is released, for example, or when the consumer just clicks on a phishing link? Would there be a difference in terms of the treatment or the remedies that the consumer may have?
Angelina, would you like to take that one?
I think when you're saying, is there a difference in terms of the treatment? I'm assuming you are asking whether, okay, OTP is a clear lapse of judgment, for example, but clicking on a link, would that be seen as culpable? Is that where you're coming from?
I suppose so, because when I read the Q&A, seems to suggest, if the degree of negligence. Sorry, we go into the legal talk.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I think it's a good question, but also a difficult one. You know why? Because it's the context, right? For example, there was one case when I did where, in fact, one of it was that, the guy checked and the number is the same. He actually went to the website and checked the number is the same. But you know what? The only difference was the plus sign. +65, that was the only difference. The main number was the same. And to me, wow, I mean, how do you fault the guy when he actually went in, checked the website, the numbers are the same. The only thing that was off, so to speak, was a plus sign, for example. So, I think it's very contextual. It's difficult to tell you a blanket answer, oh no, click this, is okay, do that, is fine. It really depends.
I also have a question about theft of identity or misuse of social information. Would this be something that FIDReC deals with when it relates to financial institutions, for example?
Theft of your
information. So, for example, the example that was raised by the attendee is a social media bot. There is, of course, a phishing bot, right? Disguised as a financial institution's bot. And the information is then released through this bot. Is such a theft or misuse of the social information something that would be sort of dealt with under FIDReC's jurisdiction?
So at FIDReC, we focus on disputes that arise from a customer relationship between the financial institution and the consumer. So, for example, if you have bought a product from the bank, if you have a credit card from the bank, and there's a dispute about the credit card amount. Of course, for the insurance context, you have purchased a policy, or in the motor claims context, it could be a third-party claim, right, with another driver. So these are generally the kinds of cases we see. If this scenario, right, arises because of the customer relationship with the financial institution and it results in a monetary loss, then generally this is the kind of case that FIDReC will handle. But if there is any doubt, I would invite you to just contact FIDReC. You can do it through an online inquiry as well. Just key in your inquiry, and then we will be able to find out more from you directly, and we can also share with you what are the relevant portions of our terms of reference that apply there, and we can help with this assessment of whether or not this actually does come within our jurisdiction.
Okay. There is a question which I think Angelina can help answer, which is the attendee said, there are for credit card transactions, there have been OTPs issued. With the feature of an OTP, why are there still so many scams out there? Or people falling?
Okay, well, let's not forget, first of all, I think different banks have different threshold as to when they have OTPs. The second thing is, don't forget, like, for example, when we have we put our credit card on certain like Lazada, Shopee, or your Amazon and all that, right? Because so it's easy, right? So you can just click and then your thing just gets processed. Now that can be hacked, or somebody could have done it, and I don't know. I'm not a scammer, right? So, and but I can imagine these are the ways where your credit card is vulnerable. In fact, in the older days, I myself was a victim where there were some foreign transactions and I was clearly in Singapore. And there was no OTP sent. I didn't obviously wasn't responsible for those transactions. So I have no idea how the scammers did that. But in those kind of situations, the bank did respond and said and send me some after a few, did I make those transactions? I said no, and immediately they acted and they reversed all those transactions. So that actually did happen to me a number of years ago.
I guess the OTP or even the digital authentication, sometimes when you use the iBanking website, are just tools to help us be more vigilant and to ensure that the transaction is genuine, right? We can never guess what the scammer would do or how they can intercept between the two communications from us to the banks and from the banks to us as well. Yes. There is a follow-up question, which is, speaking of the OTP issue and the bank, charges and things like that, is there a timeline by which the consumer must report to the bank in order for them to have a better chance of getting their money back?
So for credit cards, right, or other kinds of statements that the bank issues, generally speaking, of course, you have to look at your precise terms and conditions to see how they calculate this, but it is 14 days generally. Right? So if something happens, you should report as soon as possible, right? But no later than 14 days. And for credit cards, again, the Association of Banks in Singapore, they have a code of practice that governs credit cards. And this requires that the card issuers, the banks, limit the liability of consumers. In the situation of Angelina, they are able to limit your responsibility to only $100 if you fulfill 3 conditions, right? The first is you report immediately, right? Or as soon as possible. The second is if you are not negligent, right? And the third is if there is no fraud, meaning you are not trying to cheat the bank, right? By making false claims. Yeah. So generally speaking, broadly, each credit card company will have slightly different wording, but under the ABS Code of Practice, if you can, fulfill these three conditions, you will be able to limit your liability.
And there's also another question about, is there a difference in terms of treatments between a fraud arising from banking apps or other forms of transactions or tools like credit cards or iBanking transactions?
Okay, what I'm not sure is what do you mean by different treatment? The general principles remain the same, actually. It doesn't matter what mode of the fraud. So general principle is if the consumer has played their part, not be negligent, be vigilant, and let's say the entire, through whatever mode the scammers managed to get money out of us, is because of a security lapse on the part of the bank, then the bank will be responsible, right? But if we have contributed in any way, then we have to be responsible.
And I think just to add to that, I think the other difference is, because our relationship with our banks is governed by contract generally. And so I suppose there's a slight difference whether you are trying to rely on the credit card terms, right, which is, under the ABS Code of Practice for credit cards, or if you're doing digital banking, which is then governed by MAS e-payments user guidelines. So there is a technical difference, but Angelina is right in that the principle, under whichever mode, right, there are responsibilities on the consumer as well as the financial institution.
Okay, I'm going to give the two panelists a break because we are almost an hour into our session. I want to share a hypothetical that I have put together from looking at some of the articles that have come across in recent months. Of course, dealing with investment and cryptocurrency scams, because even as a practicing lawyer, I have come across people coming to me asking about cryptocurrency scams. And it seems to be the new thing now, right? Everyone's talking about Bitcoin. Everyone's talking about making quick bucks through investment in Bitcoins. And this is a hypothetical that's adapted from a real story where this lady, she was trying to, find someone to buy her business, right? And then through an agent, she was referred and introduced to a Chinese businessman who appeared very keen to buy her retail business. This Chinese businessman then told her that, because of COVID, he can't come into Singapore, and then of course the protagonist Audrey, she knows, she is vigilant. She said, hey, let me have a copy of your identity card and the details of your company so that I can do my own checks. And those checks were verified, right? And then thereafter, what happened was they then entered into a relationship, right? A friendly relationship in which they started talking more, they started communicating more frequently. And of course, that's when the Chinese businessman then introduces the cryptocurrency investment platform to Audrey, the person who was trying to sell her business. Okay, let me move on to the next slide. Yes, and then during this introduction to the cryptocurrency investment, there was a link sent to her for registration. And in the registration process, there was a need to pay an administrative fee. And I know what Angelina is going to say because she has said it up front just now already. But let me finish the story. Audrey then followed the Chinese businessman's instructions and invested, of course, some monies with the platform. Lastly, she then found out, of course, this entire thing turned out to be a scam. Did not expect the Chinese businessman to be an imposter, to be from a major crime syndicate. And of course, the agent that did the referral disappeared. And to be frank, this case actually was reported in the news a couple of months ago, and the lady actually lost $12 million rather than the 5,000 that I put in a hypothetical. So my questions to the panelists is, of course, You know, Audrey tried to be vigilant. Are there any things that Audrey could have done in order to, or what are the red flags that could have been flagged out when Audrey is dealing with a Chinese businessman so that she can avoid being a victim of such a scam?
You know,
maybe we'll start with you first, Angelina.
yeah, you know, Liansheng, as I was just looking at this again, what struck me is this. I mean, when we are reading this, I believe everyone, maybe many of us will be thinking, ayo, why are you so stupid? Why you suddenly click on a link and then do some money? But I think, you know, I suspect the reality is that they build a friendship over time, I suspect. And that happens actually in all of the love scams that you read about. And, you know, sometimes it's very easy to dismiss it as, well, I will never be me, so stupid, right? But I think I would like to caution all of us, and including myself, right? Because that tends to be my reaction as well. Because imagine this, right? I think one has to understand that sophisticated scammers essentially preys on our vulnerability, and they are they are increasingly patient, meaning that they are in for the long haul. Okay, they're not there to, oh, okay, you called you and, oh, cannot, then they go. They are in for the long haul, and they are going to be the nicest people, the most genuine that they may seem to be, and they build a friendship with you, and that will be in the light of the love scammers. And I suspect in this hypothetical, or this real case where, you know, oh, it's a Chinese businessman, and they became friends, I suspect. And based on the trust, she probably then, you know, said, oh, okay, you know, you're meaning well for me, you're helping me, you want me to invest, and so that we can make it, because you're a businessman, I'm a businesswoman, so, you know, we have a lot of things in common. I suspect that that's probably closer to the truth. And therefore, if I would say what's the takeaway, I think let us all be a lot more vigilant. Let's not trust that easily, particularly if you never see the person and it's on online. And I know, and I have to say this, it's not so much my generation, but the younger generation, including my children, they're very, that generation is a lot more comfortable on the digital screen. You don't need to meet someone face to face. Everybody's very comfortable on Insta, on Twitter, on whatever there is, and you know, and everybody's comfortable there, and I think that makes it even more dangerous and difficult. Because for me personally, I like face-to-face. I like seeing people, which is the reason why I don't really like staring at my little camera and speaking to a number of people very much. You know, I'd rather see the person in flesh, you know. But that's just me, but I'm recognizing that our society is changing. The culture is changing. So all I can say is we all really, really have to be that much more vigilant.
Reminded me because, you know, like, for example, even carousel transactions, you don't even see who the seller or the buyer is under a fake moniker. He or she pays, and then you just post out your items to these people.
That's right.
That's true. It was a timely reminder that actually the trends and the I guess the common practices have changed and evolved along with time. Eunice, I have a question about the payment to the platform. You know, if she did it through credit card, for example, and she discovered that there was a scam, like you say, if we do it within 14 days, and we inform the credit card of this transaction, is there a likelihood that you'll be refunded to her? What are the governing rules that are applicable to such a transaction?
When a credit card is used and you dispute the credit card transaction, and you immediately report it to the bank, your bank who issued the credit card, what that card issuer can do is then go to Visa or MasterCard, you know, as the case may be, and request for a chargeback. Or in other words, they're asking for the transaction to be reversed and the money to be returned. And this process is governed by the rules, the dispute resolution rules that Visa or MasterCard have. And generally speaking, if, for example, you did not get the goods that you had asked for, right? Or you're saying that you are a victim of fraud, right? then there may be a basis for Visa or MasterCard to reverse the transaction. But in this kind of arrangement, the job of the bank, right, is quite limited. They have no influence over Visa or MasterCard, right? All they can do for you is to try and request for this chargeback. And there might also be a process. If you're not satisfied with the initial response, you can choose to pay a fee to do an appeal, right? But in this whole role, your bank is really trying to just convey the information on your behalf and to engage in this process with Visa and MasterCard. Generally, we see that under the Visa and MasterCard rules, if it is an investment loss, right? If it's classified that way, Visa and MasterCard will tend not to grant a chargeback. They will treat it as, an investment loss. But if it is a situation, for example, of fraud, right? You had paid for something and you have not received the product, right? In those circumstances, we have seen the chargeback being granted. Yeah. And there may also be cases where the bank, even outside of this framework, right, chooses to make some kind of goodwill gesture to the consumer. That is also possible.
And that was what we saw actually with the OCBC phishing scam. But I guess there were also a lot of talk about how the banks may not be so goodwill in the future, given the sense on the rise.
In fact, MAS has come out to remind everybody that that was a very unusual case and was a one-off gesture. So I suppose MAS is also trying to send a message to consumers that we all have to do our part, right? We cannot expect goodwill payments because that is purely goodwill, right? Meaning it can be made, it cannot be made. You cannot fault people for not giving you a goodwill payment. Yeah.
And there's also a question about the role of FIDReC. So if there has been a more discussions about allocation or responsibility, how do you see FIDReC's role changing in the landscape? Would it be more relevant, or would FIDReC be introducing new measures? This is something you can share with us?
I think even in the current situation, for our mediation cases, like I shared, roughly about half of the cases, and we can get some kind of settlement. And in the kind of credit card dispute situation, this would sometimes mean that the bank is willing to waive off a portion of the debt, right? Or they can agree to let it be paid over a series of installments rather than one-off. They may choose to waive off, late charges and so on. So there is room for this negotiation to take place at the mediation stage. And what we try to do as FIDReC is to ensure that the consumer's case is put to the bank. We ask the questions so that the consumer can answer them, and the full picture is fleshed out. Any sympathetic circumstances are conveyed so that the bank has the information that they need to consider, right? And if there is any lapse on the bank's part, right, or if there is any gaps in the evidence, for example, then we can also encourage both parties to think about that and see whether recognizing that there is some gap in the information, nobody has perfect information, can there be some kind of a compromise? And so that is really what we do at the mediation stage. And even if there is a new set of framework by MAS, I think generally this will still take place, right? But also, with reference to that framework, we will also then invite both the bank and the consumer to look at this framework, right? And to reflect on whether or not they have met their obligations and the extent that they might perhaps be willing to compromise. And of course, at adjudication, then we will turn to our adjudicators, like Angelina, to apply, whatever framework the MAS comes up with to those specific facts that are before them.
Maybe I'll just add to that on a macro level, right? I think Eunice has done an amazing job as CEO with FIDReC, because what FIDReC done on a macro level also is if FIDReC sees certain trends, because let's not forget that at the end of the day, as Eunice says, we are bound to the terms of the contract between the consumer and the financial institution, whatever it is, credit card or bank accounts, there are a whole bunch of terms and conditions, right? Like it or not. So there are certain decisions, even as adjudicators, we have to make, right? Because we can't pretend that there isn't any terms and conditions. However, what FIDReC does is, if there are certain trends, FIDReC actually would have conversations with the financial institutions or MAS to see whether better safeguards can be put in place. And this is outside of the individual case. And the other thing that FIDReC does actually on a bigger scale really is to create awareness in the consumer. And that's the reason why Eunice is here. So, on a bigger scale of things, actually FIDReC has played a very valuable role in more ways than one, in addition to dealing with each and every case that walks through its doors.
I guess it's also about creating that community, right? Because you have FIDReC, who is overseeing the disputes, doing the awareness, and then we have Law Society Pro Bono Services coming together and sharing the information. Through collective wisdom, we start to find a lot more things to learn. Like I have learned a lot about the ABS rules, Eunice reminding me, that actually the financial institutions will include insurers as well, and not just the banks. So these are useful things to learn, I think. Yeah, and yes. I have a question from an attendee relating to the hypothetical, which is a very simple, but maybe it merits some discussion, which is when there's such a scam happening, does it matter whether you report it to the police or not before you make a claim with the credit card or the banks?
Generally, the banks will ask that you make a police report, because otherwise, if you put yourself in their shoes, they receive so many of these reports, and for them, the fact that you have made a police report suggests that there is some genuineness in your application. So I think you would have to make a police report, but like I said, when you first encounter something that goes wrong, right? Maybe in Angelina's case, you are that person who suddenly realized that, oh dear, I may have been scammed. Your first instinct is, if now certain banks have this kill switch, right, that they have built in, where you can turn off all transactions on your account, pause them, essentially put a pause button. If your bank has that, do that, right? Or if you can just log into your digibank account, you can change your password immediately, right? So you can take certain actions immediately to try and stop any further outflows of money. At the same time, while you try and contact your bank and inform them so that they can cancel your account, cancel the credit card, or take whatever steps that are needed to investigate. And then you make your police report, because the police report part, not so urgent, I would say. Yeah.
Basically, stop the blood flow first, stop the blood from flowing out first, and then do everything you can to recover. And at the end of the day, you need to report to police. Why? Because the police have a lot of powers to investigate and all that, and who knows, they may even be able to stop certain transactions from continuing and all of that. So why not? Look, at the end of the day, it's $12 million. You do everything and anything to recover some of it back, at least, if not all.
In fact, I think in the recent newspaper articles I've come across, where the police has also shown examples of them crushing the crime syndicates.
Yes.
So many people being involved in the entire scam syndicate. I mean, I was just reading the article, ranging from as young as 17, 18 years old to as old as 50, 60 years old. It's just quite worrisome sometimes to read this kind of newspaper.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think I was just going to say that it tells us and reminds us that not only do we all individually have to do our part to be vigilant, but Liansheng, I like the word you used, community. Your friends, your family, young people can be, lured into just giving away their accounts for some small sum of money, right? And then it can be used for this type of scam activities and facilitate crime taking place. So, it is not only just vigilant about our own accounts and all our financial products, but let's also do our part when, we remind the young people we come into contact with, or old people, anybody really, right, about all our responsibilities as a community.
Yes.
That's a good reminder. I also got a reminder from the organizer that we have about 15 minutes left. So for the attendees, please feel free to post any questions that you still have. We'll try to answer them as best as we can. I would like to go to the resources page, because I think throughout the webinar today, there have been many links shared in the chat relating to Scam Shield, Scam Alert, Money Sense, even some of the links that Eunice mentioned about. And thanks to our very hardworking colleague behind the scenes sharing all this information with the attendees. The webinar, I understand, will also be put online after it's been organized, so that at least, when you need to refer and look at, how to deal with scams or what are the things to look out for, you can have a point of reference as well. Okay, and with that, I moved into the Q&A session.
I thought we already had lots of that.
I'm trying to follow the flow. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes. There are quite a number of questions. I always say the task of the moderator is multitasking, right? I'm trying to listen to what you have to say, but at the same time looking at the questions and organizing them in a manner that we can post to the panelists. There is a question that's not related to scam, but related to FIDReC. So I thought it would be appropriate to pose this question now, which is, of course, Eunice mentioned that FIDReC deals with insurance companies like general insurance, life insurance, etc. There's a question that relates to non-injury motor accident claims. Is this under the jurisdiction of FIDReC?
Yes, we also do those. At FIDReC, there is a unique non-injury motor accident claim scheme that we call the FIDReC NEMA scheme. And this scheme runs on shorter timelines because it is in partnership with the state courts, where there is a pre-action protocol for claims below $3,000 that the claim should first come to FIDReC before it goes to the courts. So for the FIDReC NEMA scheme, essentially we also go through the same process of mediation and adjudication, but the fee for the adjudication is slightly different because we have to align with the courts, and there is a charge of $250, which is then refundable. Part of it is refundable to the winning party, in accordance with the court requirements. So we do handle those kinds of cases as well. But if you do have a NEMA claim that is above $3,000, you can still come to FIDReC, right? But it will go through the normal process. So it will not go through that more shortened scheme. Yeah.
Okay. There is also a question about, you answered the limitations, so I assume that the NEMA claims are limited to 3,000 if you want to go through the FIDReC's NEMA scheme. If it's more than 3,000, you go through the normal court scheme. Are there also anything that you wish to highlight? Are there any recent developments, relating to the ABS rules, for example, that you wish to share with the attendees?
I think in the space of the scams, we mentioned just now the MAS Payments Council will be working on a new framework for equitably sharing scam losses, right? But in the meantime, because of recent developments, the Association of Banks of Singapore and MAS have also very quickly rolled out a whole slew of measures. Angelina has alluded to some of these already. The first is, now you will not have clickable links on SMSs from banks. So we should all be very clear that if a bank sends you a message with a clickable link, then it has to be a scam. Yeah. Some other measures, Liansheng, you mentioned the notifications that we receive, right? And, being watchful of them, right? So some of the new measures will also relate to there being some minimum notifications, this will be by default set to, I think it's $100, right? So if you want to change that to lower, you do have to, log in to your digital banking account or go to your bank to ask them to help you to lower that amount. Yeah. So I think these are the key points that we should be aware of in the scam context, right? But beyond that, just speaking more broadly about all financial disputes in general, I would say that one observation I have is that many times we see that disputes arise because of perhaps the communication between the financial institution and the customer not being so clear. We see this sometimes in cases where customers have purchased a insurance product, for example, and they're not aware of it. And when they want to try and withdraw their money, then they can't, because for insurance products, you cannot withdraw your money as and when. You will have to pay a very heavy surrender penalty, which usually means you hardly get anything back. Yeah. So I will also take the chance to remind everybody, just as how MAS always reminds us through their Money Sense financial education platform, that if you are ever entering into a financial transaction, right, always make sure that you get all the information you need about it. If you truly want to invest in cryptocurrency, make sure you ask all the questions so that you know what risks you are facing. Yeah. Check. So if the financial institution tells you that they are licensed by MAS, check against the MAS Financial Institutions Directory, right? If a financial institution, and we have had some foreign organizations purport to be subscribers of FIDReC, but they are not, and people have come to us and realized that, also check against our subscriber list. And finally, before you release any of your monies, any of your personal information, confirm it directly with the bank in question, with the organization in question. And if you're not sure, speak to your friends and family. Although we really sometimes want to quickly take advantage of a good deal, the price to pay can be quite heavy. So, there is really generally no big harm if we just slow down and make sure that we check and confirm before we enter into these transactions.
And I just want to quickly add to that. This one's slightly different from a scam, but it follows from what Eunice just said. There is an increasing trend where, I'm sure we all have heard that banks work with insurance companies now, right? So sometimes when you walk into a bank and then they talk about your financial needs, your retirement plans and all that, they can then introduce you to an insurance person that has an office or a station in the bank. So, and sometimes, they will have promotional interest rates. If you take out this in product, then you get promotion. Singaporeans, when you hear promotion, sale, then we all get a little bit excited, and me included, okay? So I think that the point is, be aware, because as Eunice says, for insurance product, it is not a bank deposit. So if you commit to it and then you regret it, you will suffer some losses. Okay, so just be aware of these things. Don't immediately promotion. Okay, I want, be too eager to jump into these things. So I think I just want to create that awareness.
Relates to crypto scam as well, which have been coming across my peers, because I always tell them, if you don't know it, don't invest, because I'm not an expert in NFT or cryptocurrency. So I tend to be a little bit more cautious, and I think lawyers are always very risk averse. But I think that's a good piece of information, right? If you don't know it, try not to part with your money so easily. Like, we work hard for our monies.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, we have about 5 minutes to go, and usually it is my style to maybe ask the panelists, before we close off the seminar, is there anything that you wish for the attendees? One important takeaway, let's say, out of this 1.5 hours that we have discussed, from different types of scams, the ways to protect yourself, to the sharings by Eunice about what FIDReC does and the claims that can be dealt with at FIDReC. What is one important takeaway that you wish the attendees have I start with you first, Angelina.
Actually, mine is a simple takeaway, and that is this: don't be the April's fool. Always be vigilant and always verify. Happy April Fool's Day, everyone.
Okay, what about you, Eunice?
And for me, I would say that to prevent disputes from arising, take your time and always satisfy yourself that you have asked, checked, and confirmed, right, before parting with your hard-earned money. Also remember, if something does happen and you need some assistance, FIDReC is here, right? We are an affordable, accessible service, and we will do what we can to help with resolving the dispute.
My takeaway is I'm very thankful for the panelists for sharing your wisdom with me, because I have learned a lot in preparing for this talk and hearing the two of you this evening. Thank you very much. I'm afraid I have to bring this webinar to a close. And the takeaway for the attendees is also that the links that we have shared, the information that we have shared, will be sent via an email to you after the webinar. There will also be a feedback form that is shared with the attendees after the webinar, after you close off the browser. So we would appreciate from the Law Society Pro Bono Services Office, if you could just take a few minutes to complete the feedback form so we can improve our webinars in the future. And with that, I would like to thank Angelina and Eunice once again. Really, it's been very useful and enlightening for me, knowing about scams and the role of FIDReC.
Thank you, Liansheng.
Thank you. Because my area of
Liansheng.
practice doesn't really relate to commercial disputes and scams and the work that FIDReC does. So thank you. And also, I would like to thank the participants for joining us today. And it is the Friday night, so I would like to end off and hope all of you enjoy your weekend and have a very good weekend ahead.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Good
everybody.
evening.